All right. Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the Executive Director for the NACBS. And I want to thank you for joining us for today's book event. We're going to be hearing more about To Detain or Punish. More on that soon. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our guests and then I will turn it over to them to get started. So today we are here to hear more from Kiran Mehta, who is the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in History at the University of Leicester. Her current project explores the exploitation of penal labor in Britain, Australia, and Trinidad between 1787 and 1895. She was previously a lecturer in history at Worcester College, University of Oxford, a lecturer at King's College London, and a visiting research fellow at the Max Planck Institute of Legal History and Legal Theory in Frankfurt, Germany. She completed her doctorate in 2021 at Wolfson College, University of Oxford, and To Detain or To Punish, Magistrates and the Making of the London Prison System 1750 to 1840 is her first book that we are going to be hearing more about today. So congrats on that. And she's joined by Simon Devereaux, who is Professor of History at the University of Victoria in Canada. He has written extensively on the British criminal justice history. His most recent book, Execution, State and Society in England, 1660 to 1900, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. It is the first comprehensive account of execution practices in England and their dramatic transformation between 1660 and 1900. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming our guests today, and I will turn it over to you all to get started.
Oh, okay.
Thanks. I guess I'll speak first. It is a real pleasure for me to have this opportunity to talk about Kiran's work. I've known Kiran now for unbelievably, I think it's already been 6 or 7 years, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think
And
so.
yeah. And I dabbled in the history of prisons before being sort of massively distracted into work on capital punishment at the Old Bailey. So it's a real pleasure for me to get back to this subject as well. And above all, to get back to it through the lens of a book that I think is so tremendously useful. Um, Kiran has given us the first ground level history of changing practices of English imprisonment in the place that imprisoned more people than any other part of England, metropolitan London, which for the purposes of this book means the city of London, the county of Middlesex, short of the city of Westminster proper, and the city of Southwark. So a lot of detailed work has gone in to explaining the history of prisons that many of us, for reasons that I'll explain in just a second, don't spend an awful lot of time thinking seriously about. The narrative of prison history tends to float above the level of these institutions where, in fact, the vast majority of people are actually being imprisoned. Uh, the great strength of Kiran's book is that its focus is upon the men who both used these prisons and rebuilt, remodeled, or replaced them as both the pressure of numbers dictated and as changing ideas about imprisonment suggested. These are the magistrates themselves, the JPs who are in charge of administering the prisons, but who are also using them, and in that sense, have the strongest idea of what they're capable of doing or not doing. This is different. Most histories of imprisonment are conceived of in a kind of top-down fashion. We tend to write the history of imprisonment as though it precedes with government and or parliament responding to new ideas and then passing laws that local officials are expected to follow, to adhere to. Now, as Kiran points out, that did start to happen in some significant ways in the early 19th century. But her book shows us that even then, rather, the pace and extent of change remained largely in the hands of the magistrates, the men who best understood how far they wanted to go and how far they thought that they could go in implementing highly idealized notions of what prisons could and should be. And there's a basic message in all of this. By the late 18th century, magistrates were increasingly distinguishing places of mere custody for people who are in various stages of the legal process, from people who, pardon me, from prisons that were actively punitive sites. Hence Kiran's title, To Detain or to Punish, that captures the central message of the development that she sees working out across her period. But Kiran's story is even a bit more complicated than that in at least two respects. First, her distinction between for detaining or punishing was already broadly understood in London's prisons by the early 18th century, as she indicates, long before the conventional narrative of an era of penal reform, 1770s onwards, kicks in. It's only the great pressure of numbers, which was already apparent by the middle of the 18th century in London, that you start to see a kind of a blurring of that distinction. So in a sense, what we think of as the period of prison reform, the late 18th century, what we see going on in London is magistrates going back to where they had already set out. Reform, they were recovering distinctions that were already well understood. And secondly, the second big thing that comes through from Kiran's work, when government did become more assertive in the early 19th century, particularly leading to two types of punitive confinement, confinement hard labor on the one hand, but also mere confinement on the other, London magistrates further refined their institutional arrangements to meet that challenge without embracing every single element demanded by law or by Home Office regulation. The independence of the magistrates is one of the messages that comes through very clearly from Kiran's close attention to the sources. How does all of this differ from what's gone before, and how significant is it? Well, I'm going to basically tell you about what I think of as the three different models of prison reform history that we've been given in the past. And Kiran, of course, alludes to these in her book, but I think it's helpful to reiterate them here. We might assume in the first place that the very first model of reform was a kind of moral reform argument. This is an argument that we can see at work in the era itself. Prisons were used more extensively starting in the late 18th century, this story goes, owing to the actions of heroic moral reformers. The classic example, of course, is John Howard in the 1770s, 1780s. But there are also later figures like Elizabeth Fry in the 1810s and 1820s. But that story has at least two problems. First, it overstates the extent of the influence of people like this. Kiran shows us, especially in chapter 3, that London magistrates never embraced Howard's insistence upon separate confinement of every prisoner, or the idea that prisons should be completely isolated from the outside world. Howard's template simply isn't a very accurate description of the reality on the ground carried out by the magistrates. And secondly, this emphasis on heroic moral reformers misses altogether an earlier chronology of imprisonment. As Kiran reminds us at the beginning of her book, we can detect penal confinement in England all the way back to the 9th century. London's jails and counters had become permanent structures by the 14th century. And of course, the notion of imprisonment at hard labor in particular had been embodied as early as the mid-16th century with the opening of Bridewell, the original house of correction. Now, of course, the subsequent history of these institutions involves ebbs and flows in the effectiveness with which their ideals may have been met, but the principles and indeed many of the institutions are already in place. Imprisonment of various descriptions and sort has a long history. The changes of the late 18th century and especially the early 19th century what really involves the extension of imprisonment to the most serious categories of crime. Ultimately, crimes for which people have been executed until the late 18th century. But perhaps even more importantly, and this is a theme that Kiran pursues at some length, crimes that lead to transportation. And it's at this uppermost level where most of my expertise is floating around, and one of the reasons why I'm so enthusiastic about this book. So that's the first reform model we have. The second one I've already alluded to. This is the top-down reform model, and it's the classic narrative of the so-called rise of the prison from the late 18th century. There's actually two variations on this. There's the Enlightenment model and then the anti-Enlightenment model. This will be pretty familiar to most of you, but bear with me. Uh, the Enlightenment model, of course, argues that rational reformers, folks like Cesare Beccaria, William Blackstone, William Eden, embraced a punitive and potentially reformative model of imprisonment and then embodied it in statute law, especially the Penitentiary Act of 1779, and that this Penitentiary Act became the sort of gold standard of imprisonment towards which everything is ultimately headed. There's a lot of problems with this view of things, and I say that as somebody who's written a fair bit on the Penitentiary Act. First of all, the Penitentiary Act was not even fulfilled, and then only dismally, in the form of Millbank Prison until 1816. And indeed, arguably, it's not until Pentonville in 1842 that we really see the idea embodied in the act of a kind of model prison regime brought into force. But more importantly, and this is Kiran's point, these institutions, when they finally come around, cover a very, very small proportion of the total number of people who are now being subjected to imprisonment. And indeed, you really want the story of that, I think you would go to another volume in this monograph series that came out just a couple of years ago. Barry Godfrey, Helen Johnston, and David Cox on the Victorian prison regime. There is, of course, the dark flip side of this narrative, and this is what we owe to our friend Michel Foucault. Essentially the same story, but with the Enlightenment seen as a dark narrative of totalizing institutions. But again, as Kiran shows, the magistrates who built and administered the vast majority of institutions of confinement never really sought to implement any kind of regimes of total control. Kiran tells us about how they always entertained a kind of basic compassion for most of the inmates and a sense of human limits upon any sorts of systems of social control that might be attempted through the prison regime. There's a third model, and it's actually an older one. It dates back to the 1930s. It's famously associated with Ruscha and Kirchheimer. This is the argument. It's a kind of Marxist labor model, arguing that prisons arose as a new vehicle for organizing productive labor, that they're part of a general rise of capitalism. Now, one of the great virtues of this argument is that it calls our attention to a relatively neglected theme of prison historiography, which is the subject of the work that is being carried on inside prisons. This is a theme, by the way, that's also being front and center of a kind of a new generation of historical writing on convict transportation. There's been a lot of attention to the idea that the central most purpose of convict transportation is a kind of effective redistribution of productive labor to serve the purposes of expanding and solidifying empire. Well, Kiran's book shows us that even though the London magistrates embraced prison labor in some of their institutions, they did so with limitations. First of all, they did not pursue the purely punitive dimensions of labor, most famously in the form of the tread wheel. And this is one of my favorite parts of the book because I've really been baffled about the tread wheel. Kiran points out that London magistrates often defied the expectations of the central government, which was that the treadwheel would not be connected to any useful purpose, that it would be purely punitive, that in fact, a lot of London prisons put the treadwheel to useful purpose, grinding grain to produce food, helping to push the flow of water through the prison sewerage and water distribution systems. Moreover, a lot of London magistrates were concerned to distribute a certain proportion of the profit generated by the labor to the prisoners themselves. So again, this kind of model we have of all of which tends to be sort of all or nothing in our explanatory models. Kiran, in her close attention to the full range of London institutions, shows us that none of these are adequate. This book, in short, is a really remarkable exercise in detailed research in very difficult sources, by the way. I know I've seen some of them, um, and in historical explication. I'm immensely enthusiastic about it. I'm delighted to have it on my shelf as a kind of constant reference every time I need to know what the hell the Giltspur counter was, or something like that, or the new prison. A whole world of prisons that most of us knew were out there, but never really understood. This is the book that achieves that for us. That's all I have to say by way of my introduction, a bit longer than I hope to go on about, but there's a lot to chew on in this book. And I'd like to know what Kiran thinks, and if she thinks that I've missed anything important.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for those really lovely remarks. That's really kind of you to say, and for reading the book so closely. I really appreciate it. No, I mean, I think you've captured a lot of what I was trying to do in the book. So as you say, I was really keen to capture this local history. I mean, we would see it as a local history now, but at the time, all punishment practice is really local. They wouldn't have necessarily understood it in those terms as sort of local and central, but it is a useful way to distinguish it. But magistrates are the ones, as you say, who have most control over the punishment practices. They are judges in their own right, as well as on the whole range of sort of levels of the court. So from the assizes down to the summary courts, which I tried to take people through in the book. And as you said, they are the ones responsible for running the prisons. So I put them sort of front and center in this book to try and recover what their everyday sentencing practices were like, and what that means for everyday life in prisons. And that is different than other histories of the prison, as you say, because there tends to be a focus on prisons like Millbank and Pentonville, or Newgate sometimes, but there really haven't been that many studies of prisons, even of like Newgate, in 40 years or so. And a lot of those were PhDs that were never published as books.
Yeah.
So we really don't actually have a very good sense of sort of everyday prisons in 18th, any time before the 19th century. And so that's what I was trying to capture some of in this book. And yeah, one of my central arguments, as you say, is that in the late 18th century, magistrates are trying to recover a specialized system of prisons. So they were already quite specialized. Prisons were created for very specific purposes. Those sort of disappear somewhat or become blurry as the press of numbers causes magistrates to try and use all the prisons at their disposal for a variety of reasons. But at the end of the 18th century, there's a real move to bring some sort of order and coherence. And as you say, I see the main distinctions they're making as being between mere custody, so people who are held awaiting examination or awaiting trial, or because they have to give evidence in court or for want of sureties on the one hand, and on the other for punishment, people who've been sentenced to imprisonment as a punishment. And then there are some distinctions between those different jurisdictions, make even finer distinctions, which I go into in greater detail in the book. But the big one is between custody and custody detention and punitive confinement. And for me, seeing what the magistrates are doing helps us to understand the prison reform movement at the end of the 18th century. So you sort of picked up on that when you were talking about your models. Often we focus when we study the prison reform movement on people like Howard, and he is undoubtedly hugely important in the history of English imprisonment. And the magistrates in London were really interested in what he had to say, and they do take account of some of his model, but they don't, as you say, adopt everything. And actually what we get are sort of a series of different types of reformed prisons, which historians have missed by focusing on what Howard says is a reformed prison. And yeah, I think what was I going to address next? Yeah, I'm really glad you picked up on the bit about labor. I sort of, as I was writing this book, got more and more interested in prison labor, and that's what I work on now.
I had
But
the advantage of knowing that as well, having spoken to you.
yes, but I think it came out naturally from trying to understand why would magistrates be so keen to like, how do we explain the actual patterns that develop? Why is it that prisoners who are confined for detention or sent to jails and counters or compters, while prisoners who are held for punishment are sent to houses of correction increasingly? What explains that? And for me, it was that houses of correction would put people to work, and that it was clear from reading the sources that magistrates, when they sentenced someone to prison, for the most part, they wanted to ensure that that person was working almost all of the time they were confined. And in London, only the House of Correction could offer that. Jails and compters couldn't. And magistrates increasingly saw labor, or forced labor in particular, but kind of voluntary labor as well, as being central to punitive confinement and not to custodial confinement. And that really sets them on a collision course with the government in Parliament and the Home Office and the Prison Inspectorate in the 19th century, which I, as you say, talk about a bit later in the book, which then sort of tries to argue that magistrates, even as they're under greater pressure from the central government to fall into line to make all prisons uniform, to make labor essential to actually all prisons, and to make silence and separate confinement central to all of them, the magistrates in London are not very docile, and they sort of find ways around that. And I use labor to show that in particular. But yeah, thank you so much for your comments. I think you sort of touched on most of the central points I was trying to make, and I thought it was a really helpful
I'm
overview.
glad to hear that, because it's a very richly detailed book. I'm particularly fond of the figure on page 197, where you show us how well, I won't even try to hope that people can read this, but Kiran basically shows us the flow chart for how each county is dealing with the different categories of prisoners, and essentially creating specific institutions for those counties. This is a fantastically useful roadmap for people like me who dwell most of the time at the upper level of things, and find where the action is actually going on to be very mysterious. People are going to be very grateful for this book. I'm also fond of the fact that you're in your attention to these officials, you touch on a theme that has often kind of been emergent for me in my work up in capital punishment, which is that the officials who are running the show are often surprisingly humane when you start digging in, beneath the surface of the conventional narrative and into the records. I've been working recently on the journals of the guy who's the Ordinary of Newgate in the 1820s and 1830s. And in the course of digging through the supporting documents for that, I found out that, the London sheriffs, who are all aldermen, of course, are routinely trying to find reasons to get pardons for people who are left to die in London. And their humanity comes through in the ways that they actually administer the prisoners as well. You talk in passing about individual confinement for condemned prisoners. This is the bugaboo of the Ordinary of Newgate in the 1820s. He doesn't understand why the people who are going to die aren't being locked up in those individual cells that are sitting there for them. And again, I think it's because the sheriffs um, think it's too cruel. That they actually think, it's bad enough these people are going to be hanged. They should have whatever consolation there is of basic sociability before they go. And I sort of detected some of that same theme in your work about what's going on at the lower level as well. So for me, that's a really resonant theme. Getting away from the idea that the people who are administering the criminal justice system are just kind of brainlessly cruel arms of people at the uppermost level who can, like Robert Peel, sometimes seem brainlessly cruel. But that there's not a one-to-one relationship between what government and what the Home Office tries to get done and what's actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is different individuals. Obviously, I mean, so much of this system is like face to face as an individual, and there are some uh, prison chaplains and some magistrates who are much stronger in much stronger terms are pushing for much harsher systems, and say things like they're like these people are unreformable and they're sort of the bane of the earth, and they're committing crimes just to have like an easier life in prison, and we need to really tighten up prison discipline in order to make them truly suffer. We want this punishment to be like very arduous and painful. And then you also have voices on the bench that are advocating for a more compassionate approach, and they're always sort of being balanced, and it sometimes tips over depending on who has more power on the bench and also on the prison committees. But yeah, one of the aspects that I wanted to get across, or arguments I wanted to make, is that the adoption of the prison is seen by the magistrates in London in particular as both more humane and more effective. So it is better at punishing people than, say, just corporal punishments.
Yeah.
But then just using the death penalty for everything. It's more discriminate, it's more flexible. So lots of magistrates use the prison alongside whipping. Some use it with hard labor. It can be adapted for different degrees of offense, and to the age or the character of the offender. But at the same time, it's also, yeah, it can seem both a kinder punishment and also one that is harsher. And that is why so many London magistrates sort of take to it, because it offers both of those aspects. And I think especially probably the sections that come out where magistrates perhaps seem a bit more compassionate than the central government in particular is probably later in the chapters when I talk about labor, because as I try to say that there is a movement to make punishment a lot more harsher in the early 19th century, and some magistrates are definitely on board with that, because they see the growing number of prison commitments and crime, and they think we need to crack down on this. But at the same time, the magistrates still think, well, if imprisonment is supposed to be reformative, and if we're supposed to help people sort of have a job afterwards, we should still try and train them in useful trades. We should still enable them to have some like money and clothes and tools that we will give them on their discharge. We should create prisoner aid associations and sort of form much stronger bonds with charities who can help prisoners after they're discharged. So all of those things are sort of there is compassion at even as there are clearly greater attempts to control prisoners, to sort of limit their access to the outside world, to stop them from drinking beer or seeing their friends, from reading letters and newspapers and things like that, which, as you said, I wanted to push back on this sort of all or nothing perspective that
Yeah.
actually it's a bit more nuanced.
Yeah, and I remember years ago when I spent some time trying to think about transportation, being struck by the fact that in the 18th century, transportation seemed to be the one punishment that could appear to answer virtually every purpose of
Mm.
punishment. Being punitive in itself, retributive, but also potentially being reformative.
Mm.
Um, and I thought that transportation was particularly attractive to people because of that flexibility. One of the
Mm.
things I found really striking about your account is that it seems to me that you can see that flexibility migrating towards imprisonment as we
Mm.
move into the 19th century. Not at all levels, of course. Up at the Pentonville level, I think it's
Mm.
supposed to be something very different. But but it did seem to me that that sort of constancy is there. And it's about achieving a system of punishment that in a way is kind of broad enough to command public confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I tried to make a point in the book is that, often imprisonment is sort of presented as it's the transition from death to the prison, but actually it's not. It's death to transportation and transportation to the prison. But then the other model is that transportation and imprisonment are opposites, that like people are only supporting one or the other. But actually, at the time, death, transportation, and the prison are all seen as really crucial tools in this fight against crime and disorder. And that's the having all of those tools are seen as embedding flexibility in the system that makes it fairer, slightly more humane, and then also more effective, that some punishments are more appropriate for certain crimes and also for certain offenders. And I think transportation and imprisonment share a desire on the part of authorities to get the most out of the lower classes, to sort of see these people as resources, which isn't it. The magistrates think it's and the central authorities think it's better if you can reform them and then have these people then to execute everyone, which, as you've shown, also becomes just infeasible in the
Yeah.
period.
Yeah. I've got a few questions that I could go on asking Kiran, reflecting my fascination with the book in particular and some general questions. But I'm also conscious that we're a little bit past the halfway point, and there may be some people in the room, in the audience, who might like to ask Kiran some questions.
I'll step up. I haven't read the last two chapters yet, but I'm getting there. And you probably know my work in the sense of that I look quite a lot at Westminster, and so it was kind of disappointing that you weren't able to do that. And is it the paucity of records?
Yeah, so there are actually much better records for the 19th century, and I think had I had more time, I think in my next project, I'll work more on Tot Hill Fields, because it's a really interesting prison as well. But yeah, it was just about because I put so much stall in being able to trace for each of the prisons that I focused on the sentencing patterns and prison administration, and I couldn't really trace sentencing patterns in Tothill Fields. So I felt like if my argument was that you can't really understand the discipline without understanding who's confined, that was a problem for the 18th century. So I sort of excluded it. But yeah, it does. I mean, I have a better sense of Tothill Fields for the 19th century. And had I had both more words and time to write it, I think I would have included it, because it
I'll
also.
alert you to at least one run of sources that in the parish, St. James Piccadilly, there
Oh,
is a
okay.
run of charge books at
Yes.
the Westminster City Archives in the 1770s, and then from around a couple of years around the turn of the century, and then from 1818 to 1829.
Okay.
And eventually what you start seeing is notes from the magistrates about, okay, this person's getting a week in Tothill Fields, or let's put him away for a month. Or, of course, the vast majority of them are drunken, disorderly charges, and
Yes.
they get discharged just for having spent a night in the watch house. But my other question is a little different in that you cover a fairly long period of time, and you talk about magistrates as kind of this undifferentiated group. And I wondered, did you get any sense that either the social makeup or the perspective of magistrates change? I mean, one thing, as a colleague and friend of Ruth Paley, is the police magistrates. Do they make a difference? I mean, do they develop the same kind of willingness to thumb their nose at the central government, or does that change kind of the dynamic? Did you get any sense of that?
So the police magistrates, from what I recall, are not normally active, at least in the 19th century, on the prison committees. And I suppose that makes sense because they're like in courts or like at their summary court so often. So they don't have a huge impact on the like day-to-day management of the prison. I know from when I was looking at the differences between sentencing practices of summary courts, looking at like older magistrates and the police magistrates, is that the new police magistrates tended to be much more punitive and to apply the law more strictly than was true in the sort of later 18th century, and actually even in the early 19th century at courts that are staffed by the aldermen. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised had those people probably had more role on the prison committee. I wouldn't be surprised if they had been a bit closer to the Home Office on their visions of policies.
And again, the thing with Westminster is the degree of crossover with Middlesex. Because
Yes.
you could see somebody, there might be a group who are in both contexts. So anyway, thank you.
No, thank you so much for those questions. I see quite a few in the chat.
Yeah, let me just read out a couple comments in the chat just so they're on the recording for us. Karen writes that it's really more of a comment. I really enjoyed this volume. This is a wonderful book, especially for my course on incarceration, that clearly explains the local nature of imprisonment, and that really offers an important corrective to the more common criminological approaches, Foucault, etc. I will use it to help them understand why it is so important not to just focus on government policy. I was also struck by the examples of the humanity of the individuals involved. And then Janice also goes on to say, it's high up on my to-read list, even more so with all of this engaging discussion. And then Dave has a question, which says, Peter King made a lot of discretion as a judicial practice rather than jurisprudential principle. I wonder if you could address this. It follows on, I think.
Oh, okay. Yes, I could definitely try. I mean, yes. I mean, it definitely is I think it's quite difficult because there's like this one quote that I often go back to, and I use it in the book, and it's one of the magistrates at Union Hall, and he talks about how his role is his applying the law strictly is as much his role as it is to act as a mediator, and to like reconcile people, and to like create harmony. And I don't know if that maybe falls more into a judicial practice rather than jurisprudential principle. But I mean, I would say that I think in the late 18th and early 19th century, leading London magistrates probably wouldn't make that distinction, that they would see it as both part of the philosophy of the law and also as part of the practice. I feel like I would think they're also quite, well, perhaps this is a bit different, but the London authorities, and also actually, as I've done more work in county archives now, magistrates in other counties seem to me to feel quite strongly that their local discretion should count for quite a lot, and that they should have quite a lot of control over their own penal practice, and so really resent the growing centralization. And to me, I think, again, that maybe points to more of it as being sort of like a stronger philosophy as well as a practice. I was trying to see if I could find the quote. But yeah, I mean, if I hope that's answered to some extent, but feel free to add on if you want me to expand more. Try and find this quote. Oh yeah. The value of his police does not consist more in the strict legal performance of his judicial and administrative duties than in the exercise of a sound discretion and in the considerate application of the principles and feelings of humanity as an advisor, an arbitrator, and a mediator.
Thanks. There's just another question in the chat I want to read for you. Haven't had a chance to read it. Oh, sorry. Anne says, haven't had a chance to read it yet, but looks so good. Other than debates over transport, do the colonies surface ever as a specter in the arguments over appropriate punishment in quote unquote free metropolitan soil, or are the debates studiously rooted to London alone?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see the colonies come up very often, except for with respect to transportation. I mean, Simon, I'm not sure if you have.
No, it's no is the quick answer.
Yeah, I think the only one thing I can remember is I talk a bit about some of the debates over, so there are debates about whether you should put people to work in public works on the streets in London in the 18th century. And there's quite a lot of opposition within Parliament to that, and they talk about it as being like slavery, and how could we allow Englishmen to be slaves and to see that spectre, which would sort of degrade the convict and the English people looking at them. But it's not really a reference to the colonies as such. Yeah, I think they're maybe studiously, and also the irony there is obviously also clearly not apparent to the person speaking. The person who's speaking at the police office was, sorry, I just lost the page. Might have been Alan. Yes, I think it is Alan. And thank you, Francis Borman, for mediation arbitration.
Oh, hi, yeah, I just wanted to ask a follow-up about locality. So it's really interesting that the personality of the magistrates come through. But I was just wondering how working in different localities kind of affected their approaches, and whether the sort of character of the community they were in was important, and how the sort of types of people that they were working within. And I guess that would include their kind of economic class, and whether they considered them to be semi-criminal anyway, sort of affected the way that they saw disciplinary and sort of punishment measures and the ways in which they wanted to intervene in their local community, whether that was kind of informally or being stricter because they kind of thought that that was the approach needed.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment very much on that, but I mean, I know other historians who have worked on like poor relief talk quite a lot about how paupers would like to, it was a good idea to go to the magistrates because they would be more likely to order relief than say the parish authorities who are sort of stricter and more concerned about the rates and about the community. And I think that's true in part for, at least in London, for the criminal justice system. So the magistrates, I mean, the even parliamentary authorities often accuse London authorities of not being sufficiently harsh and of not caring enough about the like threat of crime and of vagrancy. And they are particularly annoyed that magistrates are sort of willing to listen to sort of pleas of distress and to order to not imprison them or to perhaps or to convict them in ways that the court sees as charity in order to get them like assistance traveling back or to have an entrance into a hospital. And the central authorities in Parliament are quite upset about that. And I think that speaks in part to some City of London aldermen sort of being a bit distanced, perhaps from the like need to think quite so seriously about raising rates. And I say that in part, I don't think they're immune to it, but in the other parts of England that I've looked at more recently, I mean, cost is just a much greater concern, and London authorities spend, at least now that I've also looked at these areas, they just spend so much on prisons in a way in which other authorities are clearly like making much more economical decisions because they don't feel that they can spend so much. And I think in that sense, the like eliteness of London magistrates helps. And even in other bits of England I've studied, it seems, I mean, this is very like I don't know enough to definitively say this, but some of the people who seem most like willing to listen to prisoner petitions and to order like greater changes in the prison systems that might cost more tend to be sort of more elite men with titles as opposed to other magistrates who might sort of have greater issue with that. Was community important? I mean, I'm sure that it was, but yeah, I haven't looked at it enough in order to sort of pay that much attention to the individual personalities. But that's a really great question. Thank you so much for it. I'll definitely think about that more.
Did we have any other questions? Or you can either feel free to drop it in the chat or you could raise your Zoom hand or.
I'd be happy to ask one of my questions if people are willing to indulge me.
Of course.
One of the things I found myself wondering about, Kiran, and I know, of course, there couldn't possibly have been space to tackle stuff like this, but about 30 years ago, I remember reading an interesting article by Cindy Burgoyne in a collection that was co-edited by Joanna Innes and Hugh Cunningham. And she was interested in the idea of prison reform being a kind of transatlantic discourse. She's struck by the ways in which there were sort of communicating networks on either side of the Atlantic. And we can see this in the press as well. By the time we get to the 1790s, there's a lot of attention in the London press to Benjamin Rush's work in Philadelphia, Did you detect any of those sorts of influences from elsewhere at work in London magistrates, thinking and the actual work with prisons?
Ooh, I mean, I know that there are, as you say, strong links between like the prison discipline society and their American outposts. And similarly that there and the similarly the earlier organizations that magistrates start, in which they have their own sort of traveling around and looking at prisons and commenting on them. They sort of replicate what Howard does themselves. And those also seem to have corresponding networks. But the actual magistrates that I know are on the prison committees, harder to trace whether they're necessarily impacted, because they don't tend to be the people who are on the Prison Discipline Society. So in that sense, I wonder if some of the influence from abroad and from Europe is coming more from the prison reformers who are influencing magistrates through the sort of their pressuring of Parliament and their more public campaigning. The only difference other example would be the Prison Discipline Society, some of them, like Hoare and some of the other and like leading ones, they form quite a good relationship with the City of London authorities who are running Southwark in the 1810s. And the city basically lets the prison discipline people sort of come and visit quite regularly and sort of tour the prison and talk to the prisoners and also make a number of changes. And they have quite a large role sort of in its everyday administration, but also in in the creation of new rules that are done for the borough comp during this period. And so I guess that's the transatlantic influences are sort of happening through the reformers in practice in that prison as they're sort of putting forth new rules. But the actual magistrates themselves, not many of them by the early. It's interesting that in the late 18th century, you can see quite a lot more of them as being leading voices in the reform movement. And by the 1810s and 20s, they're not really. They're actually increasingly divorced from it, although they have in some cases good relationships with individual members. And those people, those reformers, rather than being magistrates, are like parliamentarians or related to them. And similarly with the home inspectors obviously are very influenced by America. But yeah, not the magistrates themselves that I can see.
Yeah, that's an interesting contrast to that earlier chapter when you demonstrate how many of the magistrates are active in the Proclamation Society in the late 18th century. So that's an interesting change. There's some stuff coming up in the chat room, comments or questions.
In reference to what you were just saying, Elaine has asked, would there have been any contact among Quakers, especially for Pennsylvania? And Karen also commented that the ideas about labor, especially labor on public work, seems to be a rejection of American practices.
For Elaine, in the 18th century, the late 18th century, potentially among some of the magistrates, but I haven't really seen. Again, I haven't really seen that much connection to prison reform groups amongst magistrates in the 19th century. They have connections to the reform groups in Britain, but they aren't necessarily members, interestingly. And yeah, the ideas about labor being a rejection of American practices. Yes, in London, they're a rejection of how the home inspectors have repackaged American ideas, definitely. And in part, I think in part it's about like jealousy of local authority. Especially the city is very keen to keep its power and its ability to craft its own policy and to be separate from the central authorities. But it's also, yeah, the London magistrates continue to believe that even as they think punishment should be harsh and severe, that it also should be productive, and that often that is better to do in association, which really sets them apart from some of the American practices. Yeah.
So it looks like we have just 2 minutes left. If I don't know if Simon, you want to have the last word, or Kiran, would you like to have the last word, or before we wrap up, any other concluding thoughts?
Only that this is perhaps oh, I'm sorry, Andre, were you going to say something?
I was just getting ready to clap.
Okay. The other thing that I was going to say, and this may seem trite, but I don't think it is. I think McGill Queens really did a beautiful job of producing the book. This is true, I think, of all the monographs that have appeared in this series. There's a lot of illustrations, a lot of tables, and it's all very handsomely done for a very affordably priced book. So, get out your wallets, because if you're interested in the history of prisons, you're going to want this on your shelf.
Thank you, Simon. No, I also think Queens McGill did a really lovely job. It's a very beautiful book. I'm very happy with it. And they were very kind about letting me put many more charts and figures than I think are normally allowed, which I really appreciated.
Excellent. Well, thanks to both of you for such a wonderful event. This is a part of our NACBS book series. We've got a whole bunch of events this fall, and we'll have some in the spring. So feel free to check our website. I hope to see some of you at some of our other events. But in the meantime, I hope that everyone will join me in thanking Kiran and Simon for today's talk.
Thanks for inviting me to be here. Nice to see some familiar faces, by the way. Nice to see you again, Elaine. Hi, Janice. It's been a while. And can't see you, Karen, but it's nice to know you're there.
Karen, there, if you're looking for images of Tothill Fields,
Oh yeah,
they're in the Westminster City Archives.
there are quite a good series of plans at the London Archives, as it's been renamed now as well. Yeah, a good prison. I'll make sure to do it next time. Thank you everyone for coming, by the way. And Elaine, nice to meet you as well. I like your book on the police.
Thank you very much. Of course, we have Cornell in common.
Oh yeah, of course.
That's where I did my graduate work. So.
Oh wow.
All right. Well, thank you again to everyone, and thanks to Kiran and Simon. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you.
folks.